We'll find out on Tuesday if interest rates are being cut. An election campaign could soon follow, but there's one man who could disrupt both the campaign and the economy: Donald Trump. His plans to punish trading partners are more sweeping and could prove more costly than many expected. I'm David Spears. Welcome to Insiders. Labor MPs were feeling confident as Parliament rose on Thursday. They'd had a good couple of weeks, and with an interest rate cut expected on Tuesday, they're hoping to build some momentum. But two new polls out this morning might temper Labor's hopes. One points to a minority coalition government. More on that with Casey Briggs coming up. Then there's the wild card of Donald Trump. The Prime Minister had a positive call with the US President, but there are fears his tariff plans could undermine the free trade system Australia has spent decades fighting for.
This government will continue to open up the manufacturing sector through lower protection.
Our standard of living has come up because we're not putting this huge penalty on people with tariffs.
If all of us can keep pushing towards a freer system, then we will all be the beneficiaries.
We don't.
Any steel coming into the United States is going to have a 25% tariff.
What about aluminum, sir?
Aluminum too.
The move could affect around $1 billion worth of Australian exports, and there are fears this is just the beginning.
I will always stand up for Australia's national interests, and it is in Australia's national interest to have free and fair trade.
I strongly support the Prime Minister in his call for the tariff to be reduced.
When it was last in government, the coalition secured an exemption, but it took 12 months for the carve-outs to be confirmed.
This is a test to see whether Anthony Albanese's previous remarks and Kevin Rudd's previous remarks about President Trump has done this nation harm, and I hope not.
Kevin is Kevin. I mean, he'll be relishing the fact that he's in the middle of the fight.
So if Trump wants to play with Australia, I suggest you start getting your cowboy hats on and start playing. They need us.
Anthony Albanese has called Donald Trump direct to plead Australia's case for tariff exemptions.
The US President agreed that an exemption was under consideration.
It's 25% without exceptions or exemptions.
But asked about Anthony Albanese's statement,
I told him that that's something that we will give great consideration to.
A day after Donald Trump promised to consider giving Australia an exemption from looming steel and aluminium tariffs, one of his top trade advisors was arguing against it.
Australia is just killing our aluminium market.
What we're talking about here is something from almost a decade ago. Under a previous coalition government.
There was an overreach of those quotas. It wasn't a malicious act.
Breaking news from Washington that Donald Trump has announced so-called reciprocal tariffs this morning.
Well, Australia has none. On the US, we have a free trade agreement.
I just think the Prime Minister's dropped the ball here.
My message is very clear, which is we've got your back. We support blue-collar jobs. Thank you very much.
My guest this morning is Independent MP Allegra Spender. First, let's check what's making news. Hamas has released 3 Israeli hostages who were required to mount a stage and give speeches before being handed over to the Red Cross. In return, Israel has freed 369 Palestinian prisoners. That's prolonging the fragile ceasefire in Gaza. Back here, Labor is today vowing to ban foreign investors buying established homes for 2 years. It mirrors the promise made by opposition leader Peter Dutton in his budget reply last year. At the time, the government dismissed the idea as having little impact on the housing market, but Labor sources say they want to neutralise the issue before the election. And finally, 2 opinion polls are out today. A Redbridge tracking poll published in News Corp papers. It shows the coalition leading Labor 52 to 48% across 20 marginal seats. Meanwhile, a YouGov poll with a very large sample size is pointing to a minority coalition government. The ABC's election analyst Casey Briggs has the exclusive details on this one. Let's bring him in. Casey, thanks for joining us. What does this poll show?
Good morning, David. This is a really big piece of research that's been done by YouGov, starting
40,689 interviews done through its online panel. Let's start with the national vote share. And YouGov estimates if an election were to be held today, the coalition would win 37.4% of the first preference vote. That's an improvement on their result from last election. Labor would get 29.1%. That would be, for the third election in a row, its worst result since the party split in the 1930s, while minor parties and independents, they'd get just over a third of the vote, and that would represent a small increase on the record high of last election. In two-party preferred terms, here's how that shakes out. The coalition on 51.1%, Labor 48.9%, and that is roughly in line with other opinion polling, roughly a 3.2% swing since the last election. But the next thing YouGov has done here is run those surveys through a model of all 150 electorates and their demographics to estimate who is leading in every single seat. It's called a multi-level regression with post-stratification model, but David, you and I will just call it MRP. And here's what the models found. If an election were to be held today, the coalition would win on average 73 seats. Labor with a median estimate of 66. Of course, you need 76 seats to govern. 73 is just short of that. So if those numbers were borne out, Peter Dutton would be the firm favourite to move into the lodge. Anthony Albanese would need to cobble together the support of nearly everyone on the crossbench. But just remember, these are estimates. 73, that's the median result, with a lower estimate of 65 and an upper estimate of 80. YouGov puts the probability of a hung parliament quite high at 78%. The probability of a coalition majority at 19%, so roughly 1 in 5. And the probability of a Labor majority is extremely low. Here's YouGov's Paul Smith.
There is no doubt that this election will be decided by working class voters in outer Sydney and Melbourne and other parts of Australia who've been doing it tough with cost of living. What's very clear is that after this poll, the election is no longer a referendum on the government, but a choice between who will deliver best for working people.
And Casey, what does this model say about where the coalition is likely to gain seats?
It's really interesting because the potential seat gains for the coalition go above and beyond, David, what you might expect with a 3.2% national swing. And that's because the swings appear to be larger in the seats that the government holds. Let me show you the map, and let's just look at the seats that under this model would change hands. First, out in the west, we're looking at 2 seats there. The coalition would win back the seat of Tangney and the new seat of Bullwinkle, but Labor would keep most of the seats it gained there last election. Heading further east to Melbourne, well, there's a fierce battle on in both the inner city seat of Chisholm and the outer northern seat of McEwen is on a knife edge in this poll, with the coalition just ahead. Most of the changes are in New South Wales. Starting in the South Coast, YouGov thinks that Gilmore and Eden Monero would be flipped in an election held today. And then in the outskirts of Greater Sydney, look at this, 3 of the 4 seats in the Hunter region, the seats of Robertson and Macquarie as well. But in a poll like this, it's easy to fixate on single seats, but the trend is where we should pay most attention. And in this model, David, there's a lot of action happening here in the outer fringes of our capital cities, and not all that much happening in the inner cities. These areas here, they are and they will continue to be the focus of the campaigns. And this is an estimate of every single seat in the country. David, if you want to look up your own electorate, you can do that right now on the ABC News website as well, David.
Excellent. Casey, thank you very much for that. We will take a look at how the campaign is shaping up and when it might be called a little later. We're going to begin, though, with Donald Trump's trade threats. The week began with the executive order to slap tariffs on all steel and aluminium imported to the US. Now, Australia may get an exemption there. The week ended, though, with the promise of so-called reciprocal tariffs, which could be even worse for the global economy. Let's see what the panel makes of it. We're joined this week by Anna Henderson, Tom Crowley, and welcome to the couch, Jason Katsoukas. Great to have you with us.
Thank you, David. Great to be with you.
Now, Anna, let's start with reciprocal tariffs, which, as I say, came at the end of the week. And could potentially be far worse news for Australia than even the steel and aluminium tariffs we heard about earlier. What are reciprocal tariffs?
Well, every country that has a tariff or a duty that they impose, Donald Trump is saying that he will fight back and impose the same thing. And Australia has been saying, well, we have a free trade agreement, so the idea is that we're in a good position. But when you look at the fine print of what's happening here, the goods and services tax has been mentioned. So it does seem that while Australia may at the top line be, from the Prime Minister down trying to reassure the nation about this, it could have serious ramifications.
Yeah, so we have things like a GST, and Trump did mention the VAT, a similar one in European countries. We have various industry supports. We have content quotas on television, for example. All of these things might be viewed by the Trump administration as trade barriers. I spoke on the podcast this week to Arthur Senadinos, former Australian ambassador to the US. He says this is a pretty grave threat to the world trade system.
So essentially, the world trading system is being thrown on its head, and the World Trade Organization has been effectively sort of not just sidelined, but potentially euthanized.
Yeah, Tom, would this destroy the world trade system that we've had in place for decades?
Well, it would, and a lot more beside. I think that's the key thing here. We can get caught up in the details of aluminium and steel, reciprocal tariffs. They're all really part of a bigger picture of this is an American president who has taken a look at the role that America plays at the centre of the global economy and said, no, thank you. This global trade deficit that he is so animated by, what that represents is how much demand the world has for US dollars. That's why they're so desperate, why China always kept its currency down to be able to sell as much as it could into the American market. The certainty of the American dollar and American assets, it's been enormously beneficial for the developing world and for American capital, but it's part of the picture of why the American industrial base has declined. Trump wants to flip the table over. That is going to have an enormous shock and an unpredictable shock for the global economy, because a lot of the things that Trump is proposing, mind you, don't actually line up with what he says is the problem. So we don't really know what the effect of any of this will be, but the pace at which it's escalating suggests, I think, to policymakers, be ready for anything.
Yeah, mind you, it might take some time because Trump's and his people are going to go through country by country. You would think we'd be, near the bottom of the list. We have, US has a trade surplus with Australia. He wants to hit all those who have trade deficits first. Nonetheless, the global flow through of what this could do to the economy, Jason, is the concern here, isn't it?
Indeed, and there is something jarring here about, on the one hand, we saw Richard Marles in Washington last weekend talking about US commitment to the rules-based order, especially in the Indo-Pacific. And on the other hand, we see Donald Trump and the other people in his administration actively undermining that rules-based order. I think there's also something jarring about the fact that there was Richard Marles handing over a cheque for $500 million to the United States. And then on the other hand, we have Donald Trump singling out Australia in that executive order over aluminium imports to the US.
Yeah, well, let's talk a bit about that, because initially there was a phone call. The President, the Prime Minister, apparently it was very positive. The President agreed to give consideration to an exemption for Australia from the steel and aluminium tariffs. And, later in the Oval Office, he was pointing out why he was giving us consideration.
We have a surplus with Australia, one of the few. And the reason is they buy a lot of airplanes. They are rather far away and they need lots of airplanes.
We buy a lot of airplanes.
We don't buy that many airplanes. It was a bit of a mysterious one. We sort of suspected that maybe former Transport Minister Anthony Albanese might have just mentioned planes because they were front of mind for him.
Well, it worked. It worked. It stayed in his brain. But then not long after that, Trump's chief trade advisor, Peter Navarro, a big critic of Australia and what we've done when it comes to aluminium in particular, he was making this point.
Australia is just killing our aluminum market, and the President Trump says, no, we're not doing that anymore.
So here's what he's talking about. Take a look. This is Australia's aluminium exports to the United States over the years. In 2018, that's when Trump comes in and puts, he had been in place, but puts these aluminium and steel tariffs in place. Malcolm Turnbull's PM, he organises an exemption, gets an exemption for Australia. Straight after that, you can see in 2019, they shoot right up. They more than double. Now, that's what really aggrieved the people around Trump. They make complaints to Australia, and the Morrison government at that point then agrees quietly to these verbal assurances that we will keep them limited. They did creep back up again some years later under the Biden administration when they stopped buying aluminium from Russia after the war in Ukraine. But what do we know happened there, Anna, with these quiet assurances?
Well, firstly, we know that there was great excitement in Canberra after the perfectly timed phone call between the Prime Minister and the President, and then you could just hear the air going out of the party balloon as Peter Navarro's comments sort of filtered through that following day. And then, you know, sifting back through the Morrison agreement in 2019 in Japan to try and put this pressure, this downward pressure on. But then, you know, the Biden administration didn't appear to hold the government to that. And also, as you say, there were these issues with Russia. You know, there was an opening in the market. Australia didn't feel like it had to be held to what had been previously agreed to.
And they were only verbal assurances, because I think to put it in writing would have potentially breached WTO rules. And look, there's even some confusion here. I mean, former ambassadors Joe Hockey and Arthur Sinodinos and other officials have all said, yeah, we had these assurances verbally in place to limit our exports, these unofficial quotas, if you like. But within the coalition this week, there was still some confusion.
Under the agreements that we sign, there are quotas every year that are asked to be respected.
No, there was no quotas that weren't publicised.
No quotas, there weren't quotas. Anyway, the question now is, what do we do? Are we going to have to go with some sort of assurance once more to put a quota around how much aluminium we sell?
We might. I mean, that seems to be the dynamic of these things. It's important to say Australia is not killing the American aluminium industry.
No,
we represent 2.5% of global trade, right? And those numbers there, even 250 metric tonnes, I think, is about a third of what Russia was normally selling to the States. There's Canada. So we're a small part of this. But then again, you know, what it's really about, the Donald Trump sort of so-called art of the deal, is the art of extortion. You know, his attitude in a lot of these things is to use whatever leverage he has for a concession of some sort. So, it's hard to imagine that an exemption could come without giving
and keep
up.
countries guessing. You know, keep everyone guessing. Make sure you're keeping that leverage and the pressure up.
The broader question is, what approach should Australia, whoever's Prime Minister, take to Trump 2.0? I mean, at the moment it seems to be carefully keep your head down. Let's try not to poke the bear too much. But is that the right approach?
I think it's the right approach. Do whatever pressure you want on the administration quietly. We saw Prime Minister Anthony Albanese do that with Julian Assange, that quiet diplomacy, and it certainly worked in that case. Don Farrell's over there in Washington now, and I think we'll be trying to do the same thing. You know, just quietly point out where Australia, you know, what the real situation is. We're only 2.5% of total aluminium imports into the US, and I think the Australian government's got to also try and work around Peter Navarro to what extent they can. He's a very trusted member of Trump's team.
But a problem for Australia. Don Farrell, I think, is in Adelaide actually this weekend with his Canadian counterpart. No doubt they'll be talking tactics about how you deal with, because some of the Canadians are taking a more robust approach to the threats that Donald Trump is making. Anyway, time to talk to Independent MP Allegra Spender, and to take us there, here was Independent Senator Jackie Lambie, typically blunt on how to deal with Donald Trump's trade threats.
If Trump wants to play with Australia, I suggest you start getting your cowboy hats on and start playing. Because quite seriously, we are worth a hell of a lot more than what they are to us. They need us. So you stand on him and tell him we're not playing this tariff game, mate. And there's a lot going on here. And if you're talking about our national security and defence, I'd put that first instead of bloody tariffs. This is way out of an ambassador's hands. This has got to be dealt with by the Prime Minister.
Allegra Spender, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me, David.
So what do you think of Donald Trump's tariff threats, and how do you think Australia should respond?
Look, I think there are three things here. Firstly, we should expect disruption, both from these tariff threats, but also from this presidency, and we need to be ready for it. The second piece is how we respond, and part of that is building our own competitiveness, working on our own productivity, because the world's changing and we're going to have to be in the best economic position for it. But finally, you know, I think Jackie's got a lot right when she says that we do need to stand up. We do need to be assertive about what's in Australia's interest, but why Australia is such an important partner to the US, both militarily and strategically, but frankly, economically. You know, the US has a trade surplus with Australia. You know, they're exporting more to us than they're importing. It's good economics to have a good relationship with Australia.
And so as part of that standing up to Trump here, should that involve referring to the fact that we have a lot of critical minerals that the US might like? We have this AUKUS arrangement. So should some of these things be on the table?
I think absolutely. I think we need to recognise that the relationship between the US and Australia is quite profound. It's strategic, it's military. There are a lot of US troops based in Australia, as you say, critical minerals which are critical for the US as well as for the rest of the world. And I think we need to be able to assert those appropriately because those are the strengths that Australia brings. You know, we need to be able to make our own choices, but I think the US needs to be clear on the value that we bring to the relationship.
So should we be saying to Donald Trump, the AUKUS deal is at stake here and access to critical minerals is at stake here?
I think the threats is not the point. I think it's asserting what we bring to the party. And I think that the former Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull did that really well. He understood what was in a US interest. He understood what was in Australia's interest. He wasn't afraid to assert Australia's interests, but he also recognised and made the case very strongly of what was in the US's interest as well.
Let's turn to the electoral funding laws the two major parties passed during the week that were strongly opposed by you and other independents. Do you think there should be any limit on how much can be spent to win a seat?
Look, I think there should be limits around electoral spending. You know, I stood in the last election really strongly against the Clive Palmer $100 million in politics. And I think, frankly, what people wanted from the electoral reform was to get the big money out of politics and to make sure that politics was still a place that, you know, there was contest and there was really good contest. You just saw in that poll that you saw reference earlier, a third of the country wants to vote for someone who's not the major parties. So a third of the country is saying, we want choice. And I think it's critical that the reform delivers on those two things. And I think, frankly, the reform has really fallen short, both in getting money out of politics and also on making sure there's a level playing field.
This, I mean, you spent, I think it was just over $2 million in your campaign in Wentworth. This would limit spending to $800,000 per candidate. Do you have an issue with that limit?
Look, I don't have an issue actually with the limit of $800,000. My concern, however, is that I can only spend $800,000 as an independent. A coalition or a Labor Party, they can spend $800,000 with the name of the candidate running against me, and then they can spend an unlimited amount, frankly, else just with Labor or Liberal or a party name.
I think it's a $90 million limit
or $90 million.
That's a lot.
That can go a long way in a seat like Wentworth. And so the point is that, you know, everyone knows how much I spent in the last campaign. We don't know how much Dave Sharma spent in the last campaign. We don't know how much Tony Abbott spent or Josh Frydenberg spent in fighting the independents. And I think it is that sense that this idea of spending caps I support, but this idea that, you know, the major parties can spend as much as they want as long as they don't put their candidate's name in the title, I think is another example of unfairness.
But my understanding is these laws, yes, you can only spend $800,000, but Climate 200, a separate entity, can still spend up to $11 million on helping you in your campaign.
Look, I think we're still unclear on how all these laws are playing out. But I think this comes back to the challenge, right? Which is these laws did not go through a parliamentary process. You know, you have people working in the transparency space, people like the Centre for Public Integrity, Transparency International, all these groups standing up saying the process of rushing these laws through, it's bad for our electoral system. This is bad for trust in politics. And when you look at a deal where the major parties are on a unity ticket on one side saying this is good for the country, and you have the transparency and the democracy people on the other side saying this isn't good for the country, I think we should be really clear on who we should be trusting in this situation.
So, I mean, just to pick up on your point, if parties can run a national campaign and spend up to $90 million, but you can't because you're an independent, you can only spend $800,000 in your seat. Should you and like-minded independents, Teals, as they're often called, form a party to take advantage of these rules?
Look, yeah, I'm an independent. I'm really proud to be an independent, and I think what my community is asking for are people who stand up for their community, who listen to the experts and really focus on what's important to the community. So I want to be able to run as an independent, and frankly, I know that there are lots of people around the country, lots of electorates around the country who want someone who's really focused on them, and I think this is the real challenge that we've got with this electoral reform.
But given this change, it's now law, it's backed by both major parties. Do you need to give consideration to a change here? To form a party, you could still have the freedom to vote whichever way you want in the parliament, whatever rules you decide on, but a party structure to take advantage of these funding laws?
Look, I think what we should try and do is actually change the laws. You know, they have passed through, you know, just pushed through just last week. And I think that that's what we should be focused on, is having the proper parliamentary scrutiny over these laws, make sure that we get them right and actually reform in the next parliament. That's what the major parties should be committing to, and that's what I will continue to push them for.
So this is something that you would be pushing in the event of a hung parliament, for either major party to come back to rewriting these laws?
I think, yes, with the proper scrutiny. You know, what I want to see is good process, a good parliamentary process where all these issues are really fleshed out, where the community can actually listen to the experts arguing about these laws, and so that we can get to an answer that is going to get big money out of politics, but make sure there's a level playing field.
Okay, but just to be clear, you're not interested in forming a party?
No.
Okay.
I said I'm really happy to be an independent.
No, I get
Thanks,
that.
David.
Okay. So, look, just on the prospects of a hung parliament, we had the poll earlier that's, again, showing that this is likely to happen. I know you've been asked many times which way you might go. Can I ask you how you would approach that decision in a hung parliament? Which side to back? What will you be weighing?
Okay. So I think firstly, I think the first question will really be about making sure that we have stable government, which is really critical, but also making sure that we have action on the priorities that sort of my community and many others around Australia have stood for, because these are some of the big issues that we're facing as a country. So around action on climate change is really critical. Making sure we stay the course there. Making sure that we are supporting young people to get ahead, particularly on housing, but also looking at tax, because I think young people are falling behind and it is bad for the whole country. And then finally, driving productivity and innovation in our businesses, because it is only through productivity and innovation that we can actually, as a country, get ahead. Those are really three critical pieces in terms of making those decisions. But as you say, we have to wait to see where the numbers fall and see what happens. But what I will also be doing is not just about the day of forming government. It's also about how you approach decisions in the parliament. You know, and myself and I think others on the crossbench have approached in decisions in the parliament and how we vote and what we support, really on the basis of what does the evidence say? Is this in our long-term interests? What do our communities think? What do the experts think? And bringing that together, backing good ideas from all sides, working with all sides to try and get good policy through. And that's how I will continue to behave, whatever form the next parliament takes.
I want to come back to some of those policy issues you mentioned there, but I'm intrigued that your first priority was the stability of government, a stable government. So would the side of politics that has more seats than the other be an important factor for you?
Oh, look, it is one of the factors, but I think you need to look at what the shape of the crossbench looks like and what the shape of that support is. So that is certainly a factor, but I think we need to see how this plays out. It's very unclear exactly what it's going to look like in the end.
Peter Dutton has said this morning that if he has more seats than Labor, crossbenchers should back him in a minority government.
Yes, I'm sure that's what he thinks, and I think it really will depend on the numbers and the shape of the crossbench, and what people are willing, to negotiate and back at that time. So I think we need to really look at it at the time.
You're saying it's not necessarily the case that the party with the most seats gets your support?
Not necessarily, but it's certainly a factor that I will consider.
He's also said this week that the Green Teals, as he likes to call you and your colleagues, will never support a coalition. If you vote for one of the Teal independents, you're voting for a minority Albanese government, he says. What do you say to that?
I say that I have been explicit time and time again that I will work with either of the major parties in terms of forming government. And I want to draw a couple of things. One is, I worked pretty closely with the coalition on things like the industrial relations reform, because I believe that this is where my view on the world and the coalition's view on the world, there is a lot of parallels, there's a lot of sympathy. But on issues in relation to climate, I haven't worked with the coalition because I don't think they are committed to a transition in terms of the most cost-effective and, frankly, good for the climate transition that we have at the moment. So my point is I take things on the basis of the arguments and on the basis of the evidence, and I'm very open to working with a coalition government, and I'm open to working with the Labor government, but that depends on what they're actually going to put on the table and the seriousness, frankly, of what they're putting on the table as well.
So would you ever support the idea of nuclear power in Australia?
Look, I've never been anti-nuclear power in Australia, but my big point I think that we need to make is that we have the next 10 years is what really matters in terms of this energy transition. Now, even putting climate aside, the issue is that 90% of our coal-fired power stations are going to close in the next 10 years. So we need to transition in the next 10 years. No one is saying nuclear is an option within the next 10 years. And so we need to do that in a way that is reliable, that is cost-effective, and is right for the environment. And I think that is it's staying the course, actually, backing renewables, giving businesses the certainty to continue to invest, and I keep an open mind on nuclear, but I think the numbers as they stack up, do not stack up.
And when you talk about tax reform, boosting productivity, and helping the young in particular, tax reform can mean different things to different people. Just a couple of ideas. Do you think we should look at bringing back some sort of mining tax?
Look, what I said one of the things I'm most proud of doing this year, during this term, has been to put forward a tax green paper. And I put that because, and really I consulted experts, I worked with people like Ken Henry, I worked with the BCA, I worked with ACOS, I worked with the ACTU. And what I sought to do in that is to say, what are the big issues that we're facing as a country? And the big issues economically that we're facing as a country, I think one are the fact that our young people are falling behind, and housing is part of that. Secondly, that we are not investing enough in our businesses, where our productivity is in the doldrums. And finally, that the energy transition is going to cost us more than it should if we don't deal with tax. So I come back to those three things and then say, well, what are the tax settings that can help us drive or fix those three problems? And, so I have put everything on the table. I have, in that green paper, said, we should consider how we tax our resources. We should consider, for instance, how the PRRT works and whether we could get more from our taxation. So those are all the issues on the table. And what I'm seeking through that is how do we have a process around tax reform that actually deals with the really big issues that the country is facing.
And what about an estate tax on big inheritances? Would that help young people get a better deal?
So not a single economist has actually suggested that to me, and so no, that is not one of the things that has been put on the table, and certainly not one that I've ever put on the table.
Finally, anti-Semitism and hate speech, a big concern, particularly, of course, in your electorate. Peter Dutton's calling for a debate after the shocking video of those two nurses in Sydney this week, calling for a debate on migration and citizenship arrangements in Australia. What do you think? Is that something we need to look at as part of this?
Look, I think that video was absolutely shocking, and speaking to Jewish members of my community, the fact that they may go into a healthcare facility in this country and feel that they are at some sort of risk is appalling. And so it was completely shocking. So I think that we need to make sure that we do have protections in place for Australians. But I think we also need to be clear that we already have strong laws around citizenship. We already have strong laws about deporting people who have dual citizenship and those issues. What I think we really need to be focused on is actually around things like hate speech laws. And I said that in the Parliament, and I've been calling on the Coalition and the government to back me. And the reason is that, we need to stop, I think, anti-Semitism at its source, and part of that is about the hate that gets provoked and the hate that gets whipped up, particularly by some of the hate preachers, but also by some of the neo-Nazi people who've been particularly persecuting the LGBTQI community as well. Those people who are promoting hate in our community, they help drive the sort of anti-Semitism, the disgusting behaviour we saw on that video. And that's where I think we need to start. I don't think we can simply just change our immigration laws and that's going to fix it. I think that we actually need to do that. And then the second piece is we need to get back to building relationships across our communities, because that is also critical to our cohesion as a community and is a really good antidote to hate.
Allegra Spender, we'll have to leave it there. Thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks so much, David.
All right, we're going to come back to those donation laws that passed through the Parliament with the support of the two major parties, but of course, as we saw there, resisted fairly fiercely by independents. First, I want to just pick up on a couple of things. Back to our panel: Anna Henderson, Tom Crowley, Jason Katsoukas. Anna, a hung Parliament and what the independents would do. The list of priorities there, I suppose, from Allegra Spender. She's spoken a bit about this before. How important do you think the party with the most seats would ultimately be?
There will be pressure. There will be pressure on these independents to consider that and how big potentially that vote is in the end, and how many seats they need to make up in terms of those electorates in those areas that maybe in the past have been very liberal and now have moved to these independents, but the knowledge that some of the policy alignment is far more to the Liberal Party in the past. But at the same time, I think there is also an acknowledgement that some of the main campaign issues that independents have been really focused on appear far more aligned with Labor policy. So there is this tension that's being created. Really fascinating to hear what Allegra Spender had to say there, the messaging this close to an election about willing to deal with both sides.
It's very open, isn't it, about that?
Yeah.
She's not ruling out supporting, despite concerns over where they're at on climate change and other issues, not ruling out supporting a minority coalition government at all. And Peter Dutton, mentioned his comments this morning. He was on Sky News and he made this point.
It would be unusual that if we were able to achieve 72 and we were a number of seats ahead of the Labor Party, that there wouldn't be a guarantee of supply and confidence from the crossbench.
Tom, I guess it depends where the final numbers lie, and all of this is getting a bit ahead of ourselves here, but there is a question. He's right about legitimacy, isn't there? Forming government when the other side might have significantly more seats than you does leave a question mark in people's minds about the legitimacy of the government.
Well, it's an unusual position to be in, I think, given the size of the crossbench that we were dealt at the last election. If that's what we see again, then you're likely to have, 72, 73 is roughly where both Abbott and Gillard were, if I recall, whereas this time, if you had one around that number and one in the mid-60s, I can't imagine there would even be much dispute from anyone that only one party in that position is going to form government. Maybe famous last words, but if the gap is that large, it just becomes a very difficult situation for anyone with sort of 65, 66 seats, I would have thought, to govern.
And I think also if Peter Dutton was to get 72, 73 seats, he's not going to need people like Allegra Spender or Monique Ryan. He's got Bob Katter, Rebecca Sharkey, Di Lee perhaps. There's enough other independents.
He's got some options if it's a big crossbench.
Indeed, and I think he would have little trouble putting together that extra 4-5 seats that he would need.
So before we find out which way Australia's going to vote, either side's got to win this cost of living debate, right, through the campaign. We haven't even got to that, but Tuesday we'll find out if we're going to get an interest rate cut. The Reserve Bank meeting tomorrow and Tuesday. Tom, are we going to get a rate cut?
I think we're going to get a rate cut, David. I think all of the different circumstances are aligning here. You've got inflation moving in the right direction. There are some asterisks on that, being the labour market and the question of whether household spending is about to pick up again. But I think the market expects it. Generally speaking, there's cover for the RBA to cut now if they want to. And my view is that with the international picture being as uncertain as it is, the RBA will look over the next 12 months and think we would probably like to be about 2 or 3 cuts shy of where we are now in the next 12 months, because we don't know where things are going to go next.
That's an interesting point, that they might feel that they're just too high heading into a period of global uncertainty and potential for global downturn.
That's right. You don't want to be the last one with your washing on the line when the storm hits, essentially. and you don't know which direction the storm will hit because of the uncertainty of what we're seeing with Trump and with China. We could be dealing with a global recession or another burst of global inflation within the next year or so. Either one is possible. You want to adopt, with both your budget and your monetary policy strategy, I think, a neutral position. The RBA thinks the neutral rate, where it's neither constraining the economy nor stimulating it, is around about a 3.5. I think when they've got a case to get a cut, under the belt in February, that might be a good reason to do it now. Just get one out of the way, so you're not ending up having adopted a strategy of a lower interest rate than some of the other central banks. You wouldn't want to end up having the highest one in the world in the space of 12 months.
So it'll be, the government is certainly hopeful, and I can tell you expecting that there will be a rate cut quietly. If that happens, it'll be full court press of saying how great their economic management is. The worst is behind us. Look, rates are coming down now. Will it make a big difference to Labor's political fortunes, Anna?
Absolutely. It will make such a big difference to the message they can send, because rather than being in this moment in time where the opposition can continually say, are you better off than you were 3 years ago, the Labor Party could answer that with, we've just achieved for you a break on your mortgage. But whether or not it'll be enough and whether or not people at home will feel the impact of it, at least psychologically or even in terms of their bank balance, in time to actually, go to a ballot box and cast a vote is still remaining to be seen. We see these as potential reset moments, but out there in the suburbs, whether or not this in those critical seats actually moves the dial enough is really hard to gauge at this point.
Yeah, and look, I guess if the rate cut comes on Tuesday, it'll be all eyes on how quickly the PM then decides to call the election.
Indeed. Well, a rate cut would certainly give the PM a lot of momentum, and you would think that he's not going to wait too long after Tuesday, if there is indeed a rate cut, to call an election. I would expect something perhaps as early as Friday or perhaps next weekend, and for an election on March 29 or April 5.
Yeah, right. Well, we could be sitting here next week discussing whether an election has been called or is about to be called. But look, the cost of living argument will be about more than just what the Reserve Bank does with interest rates. Peter Dutton, we saw over the last couple of weeks, has been raising grocery prices, insurance costs as well. He was asked this morning on insurance, what would you do about it? And he told Sky News that his supermarket divestiture powers would also be applied to breaking up insurance companies.
As we've done with the supermarkets, where we have threatened divestment if consumers are being ripped off, similarly in the insurance market, we will intervene to make sure that consumers get a fair go.
So again here, it's a Liberal leader threatening to intervene in the private market and break up companies, as he's done with supermarkets, now insurance. I think this is really interesting. They did flirt with airlines for a little bit too, but then backed off breaking up airlines. What do you make of this one?
Well, poor old Angus Taylor. There was widely reported at the time he wasn't a big fan of the divestiture idea. I think he denied that, but I remember him saying at the time, no, it's just supermarkets. There's a special case for supermarkets. Don't worry, we won't do it for anything else. But in a sense, it's the perfect kind of cost of living announcement, because all you need to do is say we're going to bring these divestiture powers in. You don't actually have to do anything. That's in the hands of the ACCC largely. So it's a good way to sort of say whatever price category you're worried about, well, we'll break them up.
We've got the big stick.
And it is unusual, though, to see the Liberal Party, the party of the free market, talking about all these different market interventions. It certainly does go against traditional Liberal Party policy. I wonder how popular Peter Dutton's comments this morning will be with large sections of his backbench and business circles, because I think they would be starting to get a bit worried about how
far this could go.
He's got the floods in his mind as well. He's thinking about Queensland, a critical area of the country. The insurance fears around that, the costs that people are facing, the fact that a lot of people let their insurance go. He's aware of that conversation in the community as well, and wanting to, inject himself into.
And that's a real concern. I mean, insurance costs have gone through the roof, and the number of people without insurance now, you see it in exactly. It's a very good point in situations like that. Look, the electoral funding laws, both major parties did back. The Independents particularly upset that if you're a party, you get this $90 million cap to spend nationally, whereas independents don't get that. Do they have a point? What do you make of these changes, Anna?
I think they do have a point. I think the major parties, have tried to sell this argument. This is about making sure that we're not in a sort of US-style system where, big-pocketed billionaires can decide an election or can flood the market with, advertising and actually change the perception in the community, rightly or wrongly, potentially using misinformation or other tools. Whether or not this also has an unintended consequence for the government around the way these negotiations unfolded as well is something to consider, because Don Farrell, made it clear as he was the key negotiator that he was open to getting as many people on board as possible, and there were certainly options available to try and reconsider caps or look at different ways to get to a final deal that would have more people on side. But speaking to some of the people on the crossbench, they didn't feel like that negotiation happened, in their view, in good faith. Whether or not this is posturing or
well, you got that from Allegra Spender there, right? The process was not a good one. This was not an opportunity to properly explore all of these things. And you can see why they're aggrieved about that party cap being so much higher. But, Jason, in many ways, there are positive steps forward here around transparency, around trying to tackle the arms race in individual seat contests. What do you think?
Yeah, I think the legislation definitely has some takes us forward. There are those very important new rules surrounding disclosure, and what we'll see is, in effect, real-time disclosure of donations in the election period. I think the $5,000 threshold is a significant advance on the previous threshold of
which is like nearly 17 grand. Yeah.
I also think we shouldn't be too surprised at what Don Farrell's done. He's a very traditional party political operator. He signalled very, very early on in this process, I think, that he was most interested in protecting the position of the two big parties, the two-party system. So I don't think it's all that surprising that Don Farrell has done what he's done.
I think in the end, though, I mean, I tend to think that everyone got what they wanted out of this week. The major parties got their bill. The crossbenchers are making a lot of hay talking about this, and I think making a lot of money talking about this as well.
Yeah, some of their donations went up, didn't they?
Yeah, they did. And they're running ads saying things like this is rigging elections, which I think is the kind of language they might want to be a little careful about. I think there's some hyperventilation going on here, to be quite honest. The little exchange that you had with Allegra Spender there, just to be really clear, it is absolutely the case that Climate 200 can advertise with independent faces and names. It's been put to me they can even have a carbon copy of an independence ad. It's a specific carve-out that exists in some state laws that prevents that from happening. It is not in the federal law. So Climate 200 can spend above the $800,000 cap on behalf of independents in their seats. It's a workaround for them. Look, at the end of the day, the constraints that this bill imposes on everyone are sort of minor, a bit more like a ceiling on the arms race than anything else. Of course, Don Farrell, out of the goodness of his heart, hasn't really significantly constrained Labor's funding activities. But there is a genuine attempt on the Clive Palmer side of things. It'll be sorted out in court. I think, wait to see how these actually work before we judge this bill as well.
On housing, so last year, budget reply, big announcement from Peter Dutton, we're going to ban foreigners buying existing homes in Australia for 2 years. Labor, they spent months, didn't they, saying, that's not going to make any difference, it's such a small number and not worth doing. Today, they've done it. Why?
Well, in the background of this is a knowledge that this is one of the key kind of campaign points for the coalition around this idea of foreign investors buying up housing, making it harder for you to buy a home. And Labor is trying to neutralise that argument by just moving on this early so that it doesn't become a big sort of in the trenches moment in the campaign. There is a view that this will help with the potential social cohesion issues that come out of that kind of a debate. But there's also a knowledge from Labor that this can cut through. Yeah. But it's such a small amount of houses. We're talking less than 2,000 in the 22-23 year. This is not an issue which is dramatically impacting housing supply.
But it's popular. Now, I was given this poll before today's announcement from Labor. This is from JWS Research. It's True Issues survey. It's looking at a lot of different policy ideas and their net popularity, net support levels. So right up the top is this 2-year ban on foreign home buyers. You can see plus 59 is the popularity of it. But it's a really interesting list, right? The cut in, I'll get to that. The cut in migration, which Peter Dutton's talking about, is also popular. The Federal Environment Protection Authority idea is quite popular there as well, the one that Labor has shelved for this term of Parliament. The carbon price is net positive as well, bringing in some sort of new carbon price. But look down the bottom, cutting the public service, not so popular. Tax breaks for small business lunches. That one's bombed a bit as well. So it's an interesting look at what's floating the boat of voters at the moment. But on the housing one, it's a popular idea. And the government also this week moved to say your HECS debt shouldn't be included when banks weighing up whether to grant you a mortgage. Will that make much of a difference, Tom?
Look, it's a modest change to use the government's own language, but it is the kind of thing that a lot of people in my age cohort are very aggravated about, their HECS debts, seeming to make it harder for them to get a home loan. This is just a tweak, really, to the guidance that the financial regulators will give banks. So it might make the difference in some cases, like when you've got a doctor who's got a really large HECS debt and the banks want to loan to them, but they've got a really large debt that they're required to take into account. This loosens some of that.
I think just back on housing, what's interesting is Peter Dutton has suggested that the coalition might restore the so-called golden ticket investor visa.
Yeah, good point.
Which is the last time that was in place in 21-22, I think we saw about 2,700 people get that golden ticket.
How many of them would have bought a home?
I think it's around 85%.
Right, okay.
So that probably cancels out yes, on the one hand, he's got the foreign buyers ban, but people who get that foreign investor visa, the golden ticket visa, they would be eligible to buy homes. under that visa.
I think he said this morning you'd work through these issues with the department in government, but you can be sure that's a point Labor will be making, that he might want to ban foreigners, but buying homes, but he wants to bring in all these golden ticket visa holders.
The Dutton policy actually excludes permanent residents and visa holders from purchase as well. You have to become an Australian citizen.
There you go.
Well, I think when you get that golden ticket visa, you are on an immediate path to citizenship. So I think there's some question as to whether you'd be eligible to buy a house. But under the previous rules, it seems like you would be eligible to buy a house straight away.
A final issue, that shocking video of those nurses in Sydney mentioned there with Allegra Spender. The two nurses who are on video allegedly threatening to harm and even kill Israeli patients. Look, they've apologised. Police are continuing to investigate. No charges yet laid. The Prime Minister, though, by the way, seems pretty sure that a crime has been committed.
It is very clear to me that these people have committed what are crimes, and they should face the full force of the law.
And look, Peter Dutton has said that there needs to be a discussion around our migration and citizenship settings here, but Jason, one of those nurses was actually granted a visa when Peter Dutton was the Home Affairs Minister.
Well, indeed, and I think, the High Court has said very clearly that ministers don't have or should not have the power to cancel someone's citizenship. So
only the court can do that under our current laws, right?
That's right.
You can cancel a dual Australian citizenship, but the court has to make the call.
That's right, and I think it would need a change to the Constitution for a minister to be able to do that. So I think what Peter Dutton is saying is probably popular, but it's probably also just for show. He knows that it would be very difficult to change the Constitution for something like that. There's also a question of there are other avenues of punishment available in our legal system. If these people have committed crimes, they can be punished in other ways than just having their citizenship cancelled.
Or is he talking about a more rigorous process to get citizenship than we currently have in place to, I don't know, try and preempt these sort of problems down the track? Is that what he's suggesting?
We've only sort of got a few seconds really to go on so far of what he said, so I suppose we'll wait and see as it evolves, but it's becoming a familiar pattern on this issue really, that Peter Dutton will sort of take out to a new policy area, and Labor, a bit like with the foreign buyer ban, in a bid to neutralise, will often follow in a couple of weeks, so we'll see how it crystallises.
Yeah, I think they are both Australian citizens, both of those nurses in that video. As you say, one who was given that citizenship under Peter Dutton as minister,
visa at least,
the visa under Peter Dutton, but also I think he's reflecting the community sentiment. And sometimes that doesn't align with what's legally possible, but Peter Dutton is very good at reflecting what a community reaction, a pub test might sort of say in response to something like that.
All right, our panel, Jason Katsoukas, Tom Crowley and Anna Henderson, back in a moment with some final observations. Time now for Mike Bowers and Talking Pictures.
I'm photographer Mike Bowers. I'm talking pictures this morning with columnist for The Australian, Jack the Insider, and a warm welcome. A lot of sort of end of school energy to these 2 weeks of Parliament. Everyone was a flap.
There was, yeah, there's a fair amount of flapping, thinking that the election might be called.
Yeah, the PM's call to Trump may not have gone as well as he'd had hoped for, but apparently terrific conversation.
He was described by President Trump as a very fine man.
A very fine man.
Very fine man. You can't do any better than that.
Lovely David Rowe, the balancing act, and his elbow here balancing. And I do love this. Peter Dutton's on the medal pedal.
Yeah, that's hard work, and he's really just trying to hang on there.
Really balancing it beautifully. Fiona Katauskas, welcome to the Foreign Leader Hotline.
To praise President Trump for the tremendous job he's doing, press 1. To discuss his plans to take over your country territory, press 2. To grovel for tariff relief, press 3. I think you just want to go bang 1, 2 and 3, wouldn't you?
Probably 1 a couple of times, like one. You are great, you are wonderful, you are the best. David Pope might be something lost in translation here, he thinks, with President Trump.
It's nothing personal, Aussie guy, but there are no allies, only adversaries and suckers. He seems to have borrowed Elon Musk's ermine coat and crown, but
He wants to reassure us he doesn't view Australia as an adversary with all the advisors around. Kathy Wilcox has got AUKUS's bait here with the merman Albanese.
yes, there he is reaching for it. I mean, is it going to be made from Australian steel or American or US steel, the nuclear subs?
Well, it'll probably have some aluminium in it.
That's right, yeah.
I love this, Matt Golding. It's a beautiful call, the perfect call. He called me a very fine man.
Very fine man.
Using the Trump playbook.
There you go.
Brett Lethbridge is channeling the Teddy Roosevelt line to speak softly and carry a big stick.
Carry a big stick. Donald doesn't speak softly at all. So there's a very tiny one for Russia, somewhat larger for China. Oh, yeah, that looks nasty. EU, Canada, Mexico and Australia.
Yeah. Panama and Denmark get a bigger one.
Yeah, they get a big one. And Hamas, nails in that one. Yes.
During debate on the hate crimes bill, the Attorney-General Mark Dreyfus was up and speaking about being the grandson of a Holocaust survivor.
Yes.
And during that debate, the manager of Opposition Business, Michael Sukkar, moved that he no longer be heard.
Yes, and this was reported in the Australian Jewish media as interrupting the Shoah story. I think it was a very grave error on the part of the opposition.
Now, this is an Alex Ellinghausen shot. You don't see this genuine sort of shock all that often.
There was a general sense of what the hell happened there.
what was going on there, and a flash of genuine anger. Now, I did love this Matt Golding cartoon. They say no news is good news, Jack, but there certainly doesn't seem like there's much good news around at the moment. How would you like to work on the Donald desk?
Well, you'd be busier than the sport and the weather. That's for a certainty. It's kind of overwhelming at the moment.
Megan Herbert thinks we need a whole bunch more emojis catching up on the news then and catching up on the news now. A couple of nurses from Sydney's West distinguished themselves.
Absolutely appalling stuff, and they're currently under investigation. We'll see if they're going to be charged with criminal offences, but what it does is really attacks the trust that's been built in the public health system. It's just extraordinary.
Yeah, Warren Brown has got a pretty troublesome patient here, anti-Semitism.
Yeah, we do have a problem.
You're growing stronger and stronger every day, and Mark Knight got him in the bin. We were only joking about killing Jewish patients. Can't you infidels take a joke?
It really just strikes at the public confidence in our health system. We've got one of the best health services in the world, and this is certainly not helping. Not for Jewish Australians, and not really for all of us, really.
Yeah. Jack, thanks for unpicking events this week. I'll let you do the honours.
My pleasure, Mike. It's back to you, Spearsy.
Thank you, Jack. Thank you, Mike. Let's get some final observations. Jason.
I think Liberal Party strategists are getting increasingly worried that the retiring Liberal members in the seats of Leichhardt, McPherson and Braddon are not doing enough to help the Liberal candidates in the coming poll, and that might give Labor an opening certainly in Leichhardt and Braddon, and there's a prominent Teal candidate running in McPherson, and there's a bit of a concern that those seats...
the ones on the way out should do a bit more. Interesting. Tom?
A bit of an election-themed final observation as well. Just a warning as we head into election season, just to separate the talk about the third-party vote with the size of the crossbench. I thought the really interesting thing in that MRP that Casey showed us earlier was that the third-party vote gets to a record level and the crossbench shrinks. Those two things can happen at the same time because same as it ever was in Australia, it's got to be concentrated. The Greens had a primary vote above 10 for a long time and they only won one seat. So if it's scattered like it was in the Werribee state by-election, well, only Labor and Liberal ever had a chance of winning that seat, and that'll be true in most seats this time around again.
Yeah, good point. Anna?
And the Closing the Gap statements to Parliament this week from the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader have unfolded, but it's interesting to note that the Shadow Minister, Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price, in the portfolio is not ruling out the idea of potentially dramatically changing the targets for Closing the Gap. While she's talking about the headline remaining, what Closing the Gap actually looks like if the coalition would be elected could be very different.
Yeah, interesting point. Thank you all for joining us this morning. Finally, when you're a politician trying to bag your opponents, best not to accidentally mix up Anthony Albanese and Peter Dutton. The Prime Minister moved to shore up some votes in Tasmania yesterday. He vowed new laws to protect the salmon industry despite environmental concerns there. The reaction from the state's Liberal Environment Minister seemed to startle her federal Liberal colleague in the background. We'll leave you with that. Thanks for watching.
Industry, government, science working together. We've been calling for a solution to this problem. It's a little bit too little too late from Mr Dutton, who I think is in a bit of political trouble with this one, but I think Senator Duniam would like to speak to that.
You're making us all feel very excited about being here.